August 23, 1942. German bombers fill the sky over the Volga River. Below them lies the city of Stalingrad, a crowded industrial center with over 500,000 civilians still inside. The first wave of Luftwaffe planes drops hundreds of tons of bombs. Within hours, entire blocks are on fire. The river glows orange from the reflection of the flames. The attack lasts through the night. Rail stations explode, hospitals burn. Tens of thousands die before the battle even begins. The Germans watch from across the steppe, believing the city is finished. To them, this is routine. They have crushed city after city on their way east. Stalingrad will be no different. But the bombing doesn't break Soviet resistance. It does the opposite. In the ruins that remain, Soviet soldiers and civilians prepare to fight. Women dig trenches. Factory workers repair tanks under fire. The city is no longer a place to live, it's a fortress. On the far bank of the Volga, reinforcements begin to arrive by boat. The crossing is chaos. The Germans shell the river constantly. Boats catch fire or sink halfway across. Men drown trying to swim through the wreckage, but still more come. General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 62nd Army, lands on the West Bank and takes command. His order is short, not a step back. The Battle of Stalingrad has begun. A year earlier, in 1941, Germany had invaded the Soviet Union under Operation Barbarossa. The Wehrmacht swept through vast territories, taking millions of prisoners. But when winter came, their advance stalled outside Moscow. Hitler blamed the failure on the weather and poor planning. He believed one more big offensive could win the war. So in the summer of 1942, he turned south. His goal was to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city on the Volga that carried Stalin's name. To Hitler, Stalingrad was both strategic and personal. Controlling it would cut Soviet supply lines and deal a humiliating blow to Stalin himself. By late summer, the German 6th Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. They were supported by tanks, artillery, and the Luftwaffe. The city stood in their path like a wall of smoke and rubble. Paulus reported that victory was near. He was wrong. The Soviets knew they couldn't match Germany's firepower head-on. Their only option was to hold the city at all costs. Reinforcements crossed the Volga day and night under constant bombardment. The crossing became a death trap. German planes hunted anything that moved on the river. Boats sank, ferries burned, and men often waded through waist-deep water carrying weapons above their heads. When the soldiers finally reached the city, many found no officers waiting for them. Units were scattered. Ammunition was low. Some men were given rifles without bullets. The command was simple: fight until you die, then someone else will take your place. The Soviet defensive line was made up of what was left of regular troops, factory workers, and local militias. Artillery batteries were set up inside broken buildings. Machine guns were mounted in apartments, schools, and grain silos. Even the women who once worked in factories now carried rifles. German forces pushed in from the west, expecting another quick victory. But every street was defended. Every pile of rubble hid someone ready to shoot. The Luftwaffe's bombing had destroyed the city. But in doing so, it had created a perfect battlefield for defense. Tanks couldn't move easily among the ruins, and snipers hid in every shadow. Chuikov's headquarters was set up in a bunker near the riverbank. His message to all units was the same: hold fast, die where you stand if you must, but don't retreat. Soviet soldiers obeyed. By September, the Germans were inside the city. What followed was some of the most brutal close-quarters fighting in modern history. Both sides fought for single streets, buildings, and even individual rooms. German troops called it the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. The term was fitting. Soldiers fought in basements, stairwells, and rubble-filled trenches only a few meters apart. Grenades were thrown through holes in walls. Knives and shovels became as deadly as rifles. Snipers hid in the wreckage of factories and shot at anyone who moved. The Soviets adapted quickly. They fought in small teams that would appear suddenly, strike, and disappear again. When German soldiers captured a building, Soviet troops would often attack it again the same night. The front lines were constantly shifting. The Red October factory, the Barricade factory, and the grain elevator became battlegrounds that changed hands multiple times. The Germans would storm in with tanks, lose them in the rubble, and retreat under fire. The Soviets turned each ruin into a fortress. Paulus reported to Hitler that victory was near, but every day the line barely moved. German officers wrote in their diaries that Stalingrad was hell on earth. The closer they got to the Volga, the harder the resistance became. Inside the ruins, Soviet snipers picked off officers and machine gunners one by one. Among them was Vasily Zaitsev, who became famous for killing hundreds of Germans during the battle. His calm, patient shooting turned him into a legend among Soviet troops and a symbol of hope. By October, the city was a wasteland. Smoke blocked the sun. Buildings that had stood for decades were now piles of concrete and twisted steel. The Volga was filled with burning boats and floating debris, yet the Soviet line still held. The Germans had taken 90% of the city, but they couldn't finish it. Each day they advanced a few meters. Each night, the Soviets took it back. The Wehrmacht, once unstoppable, was now trapped in a nightmare of its own making. In the middle of the destroyed city stood a 4-story apartment building overlooking the Volga. It became one of the most famous positions in the battle. Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and about 24 Soviet soldiers captured it in September 1942 and refused to give it up. The Germans attacked it constantly with tanks, artillery, and infantry, but Pavlov's men held for nearly 2 months. They turned the building into a fortress. Every window was a firing point. The walls were reinforced with sandbags, and trenches connected the basement to nearby buildings. Even the roof had snipers. When German tanks tried to approach, the defenders waited until they were close, then destroyed them with anti-tank rifles and grenades. At night, supplies were brought across the Volga under heavy fire. The soldiers slept in shifts and lived on whatever food they could find. The Germans nicknamed it the Fortress. When the war ended, Pavlov said, "The Germans took a building in 2 hours. We held one for 60 days." His stand became a symbol of Soviet resistance throughout the country. By October, the German Sixth Army controlled almost all of Stalingrad. But almost was not enough. The last Soviet defenders still held a thin strip of land along the Volga, just a few hundred meters wide. German soldiers expected the Soviets to break at any moment. Instead, they kept fighting. Snipers and small assault teams attacked from ruins the Germans thought were empty. Ammunition was short on both sides, and soldiers fought hand-to-hand inside buildings filled with corpses and rubble. Paulus's army had been fighting non-stop for months. Supplies were low and the troops were exhausted. The Luftwaffe could no longer bomb effectively. The city was too destroyed to target. Winter was approaching, and the temperature began to fall below freezing. German soldiers were not prepared. They still wore summer uniforms. Oil froze in weapons. Vehicles broke down. The same soldiers who had once marched across Europe now fought for survival in the ruins of a single city. Inside his bunker, General Chuikov told his men, "The enemy has reached his limit. We will hold and then we will strike." The German advance slowed to a crawl. Every street was a graveyard. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets launched a massive counterattack called Operation Uranus. It didn't begin inside Stalingrad. It began outside it. For months, the Germans had focused all their strength on the city itself, leaving their flanks, north and south, guarded by weaker Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian divisions. The Soviets knew this and used it to their advantage. In freezing weather, over 1 million Soviet soldiers attacked from both sides. Tanks rolled across the snow-covered steppe, smashing through the thin Axis lines. The Romanians and Italians broke quickly. Within days, the Soviet forces from the north and south met at the town of Kalach, west of Stalingrad. The encirclement was complete. Nearly 300,000 Axis troops, mostly Germans, were trapped inside the city. For the first time in the war, the German army had been surrounded. The hunters had become the hunted. Inside the pocket, Paulus realized what had happened. He radioed Hitler for permission to retreat. Hitler's response was simple: Stalingrad must be held. The army will stand fast. Hitler promised that the Luftwaffe would supply the trapped army by air. But the numbers didn't add up. The men needed at least 700 tons of food, fuel, and ammunition each day. The planes could barely deliver 100. At first, Paulus believed help would come. Within weeks, he knew it wouldn't. By December, the German soldiers inside Stalingrad were living in frozen ruins. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees C. The Volga had turned to solid ice. Food was gone. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Soldiers boiled leather, paper, and even wallpaper paste to survive. Frostbite claimed as many lives as bullets. Wounded men froze to death where they lay. The Luftwaffe tried to keep its promise, but Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns shot down dozens of transport planes every day. Only a fraction of supplies reached the city. The airfields themselves became targets. Paulus sent message after message to Hitler, asking permission to break out. Hitler refused every time. He insisted that relief would come, but the relief force under Field Marshal Manstein never reached the city. Soviet resistance stopped them far to the west. Inside the pocket, discipline collapsed. Soldiers scavenged for food, burned furniture for warmth, and dug holes in the snow to sleep in. The once-proud Sixth Army, which had marched across Europe, was starving to death in the ruins of Stalingrad. Some units began surrendering on their own. Others kept fighting because they knew the Soviets would show no mercy. By the end of the year, the German front line had shrunk to just a few square kilometers. The city that once symbolized Hitler's ambition had become his army's grave. By January 1943, the German Sixth Army was finished. It no longer resembled a fighting force, just scattered groups of starving men holding out in cellars and basements. Ammunition was almost gone. Medical supplies were gone. The wounded lay in unheated rooms, wrapped in blankets that froze stiff. General Friedrich Paulus, once confident and disciplined, now looked defeated. His headquarters was in a wrecked department store near the city center. Soviet shells landed nearby every few minutes. His officers urged him to surrender, but Hitler's orders still said otherwise. No surrender. Fight to the last bullet. Paulus sent one final message to Berlin. We can no longer fight effectively. Food and ammunition exhausted. Hitler's reply: the Sixth Army will stand fast. He promoted Paulus to field marshal, adding, no German field marshal has ever been captured alive. The message was clear. Hitler expected him to die, but Paulus refused to commit suicide. He told his staff, I have no intention of shooting myself for that Austrian corporal. The Soviets, closing in from all sides, offered one last chance to surrender. Paulus didn't respond. The fighting continued for a few more days, but it was over in all but name. On January 31, 1943, Soviet troops surrounded Paulus's headquarters. His guards surrendered without resistance. Soviet officers entered the building and found Paulus sitting quietly at a table. He stood, saluted, and was taken prisoner. 2 days later, the remaining German pocket in the north, commanded by General Strecker, also surrendered. The Battle of Stalingrad was officially over. Out of nearly 300,000 Axis soldiers trapped inside the city, about 90,000 were taken prisoner. Most were frostbitten, starving, and too weak to walk. They were marched east to prison camps in the snow. Fewer than 5,000 would ever return to Germany. The rest froze or starved in captivity. When news reached Berlin, Hitler was furious. He refused to believe the Sixth Army was gone. For days, German radio broadcasts claimed the battle was still being fought. But the truth spread quickly. The army that had once seemed unstoppable had been destroyed. For the first time, Hitler's generals began to question his leadership. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht was broken. The Battle of Stalingrad lasted over 5 months. When it ended, the numbers were staggering. The Germans lost around 850,000 soldiers, killed, wounded, or captured. The Soviets lost even more, over 1 million dead or wounded. Civilian losses were almost impossible to count. Before the battle, Stalingrad had a population of more than 500,000. After it, fewer than 2,000 were found alive in the ruins. The city itself no longer existed. Streets were gone. Buildings were nothing but piles of bricks. Factories, schools, hospitals, all destroyed. The Volga was clogged with wrecked tanks, sunken boats, and bodies frozen into the ice. For months after the battle, Soviet soldiers still found corpses in basements and tunnels. Dogs and rats roamed freely through what used to be neighborhoods. But the Soviet victory was undeniable. The German advance into the east was over. From this point on, Hitler's armies would never regain the initiative. Stalingrad marked the moment when the war in Europe began to turn. Stalingrad was not just a military victory, it was a turning point in world history. Before the battle, Hitler's army had reached deep into Soviet territory. After it, they began a long retreat that would end only in Berlin. The defeat destroyed Germany's best army and broke the confidence of its allies. It also changed how the rest of the world saw the war. The Western allies realized that the Soviets could stand on their own and win. Stalingrad gave hope to nations still under occupation, showing that Hitler could be beaten. For the Soviet Union, it became a symbol of national pride. The soldiers who fought there were celebrated as heroes. Streets, cities, and schools were named after them. Every year, survivors gathered on the banks of the Volga to remember those who never came home. Stalingrad proved that determination and endurance could overcome even the strongest enemy. It showed that the human will to resist was more powerful than any weapon or strategy. From that moment, the war's direction was clear. The Red Army would push west, and Germany's defeat was only a matter of time. After the war, Stalingrad was rebuilt from the ground up. New homes rose where ruins once stood. The city's factories were restored, its streets widened, and its monuments rebuilt. In 1961, it was renamed Volgograd, but to many around the world, it would always be remembered as Stalingrad. The battle became a lesson in endurance and sacrifice. It reminded the world that courage is not only in victory, but in refusing to give up when defeat seems certain. For Germany, it was a wound that never healed. The loss of the Sixth Army marked the beginning of the end of Hitler's empire. For the Soviet Union, it was proof that no invader, no matter how powerful, could conquer its people's will to fight. Even today, the name Stalingrad stands for resistance against impossible odds. It reminds us that war is not only fought by generals and plans, but by soldiers freezing in trenches, civilians hiding in basements, and commanders making impossible choices. The city on the Volga stopped the most powerful army in Europe. It changed the course of history. Millions died, but their stand turned the tide of the war. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just the defense of a city, it was the defense of a nation. And it proved that even in total destruction, there can still be victory.